Hi everybody and welcome to Behind the Viz with Diego Parker. I am Steph Kearns and I'm a consultant here at the Information Lab. I am here mainly to keep an eye on the chat while Diego is presenting. I'm sure some of you know who Diego is already, but just to give him a little intro, Diego is one of our amazing data school consultants here at the Information Lab. He is also a Tableau Forum ambassador, which has recently been announced. And yeah, so he's been that before, but it's been announced again. So congratulations to him on that. So today he's going to tell us about his Iron Viz submission, the inequality pandemic. So as a Chilean himself, Diego wanted to create an Iron Viz entry to compare how inequality in Latin America has affected the spread of coronavirus there. So he'll take us through where he got the inspiration for the Viz, how he collected the data, and how the Viz came into being. So as I say, if you ask your questions in the chat as we go, so drop any comments you have in there, say hi, and other than that, all there is to say is over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Steph, for the intro. Can I confirm that you can hear me?
I can.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Diego Parker. And as Steph said, I'm a current member of the data school, part of the 12th cohort, the training program of the Information Lab. I have a background in international relations and public policy. One of the reasons why this piece was a bit close to heart and something that I felt very enthusiastic about to create. And well, also and more importantly for this occasion, I'm from Chile and I moved to the UK 2 years ago when I joined the Information Lab. If you have any questions or comments about this session, you're free to contact me on Twitter at Diego Park, and I'll do my best to answer as soon as possible. So let's get started about what we're going to be talking today. So this is not really like a technical session. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details of each technical bit or each data prep work that was done, but it's going to be mainly focused first on the story behind the Viz, where I got the inspiration, why did I decide to join Iron Viz at this occasion, then some of the goals that I had in mind, the type of piece that I wanted to create, the story that I wanted to convey, the audience that I was aiming to give my message to. We're going to talk a bit of the data too. How did I source the data? Where from? Some issues when you're working with all multiple sources, and also a data that is in a topic that it can be a bit controversial. There's a lot of government data, official data, and when you're using COVID data, you have certain responsibility when building a base. And we're gonna touch very slightly on the prep, and I'll give you a little tour of the beast, and we'll be able to discuss each one of the parts that make the beast. So the story behind. I was thinking before going completely into the PowerPoint, I want to give you a small overview of like the beast, so you get an idea of like, okay, what it was built, and in case that you haven't seen it, if I mention something that relates to the beast, you can refer to it. In this case, I'm showing you the Spanish version. As you may know, or some of you may know, this was built in both Spanish and English, and I'm going to explain you that after. So this is the long form, just to facilitate me showing you and showing you a bit the components of this beast. So the beast, the idea is that it takes you in a bit of a journey. This would be like the introductory page, and it shows you, it puts you on the topic. It introduces the story, and then also it gives you the idea of how I'm delivering this piece, and it's the whole idea of like, okay, Latin America is the patient, and then this could be like the journey of the patient from the symptoms, the treatment, the causes to its illness. So then I would go around the symptoms, and as you can see, most of these visualizations, are not complex visualizations. I wanted something that looks a bit like a kind of like showing into like a magazine or something like that. So then the symptoms will explain you a bit of the background of like what's happening in Latin America about inequality that is there. Then you would have the diagnosis that it shows you a bit like, okay, how is COVID spreading in Latin America? And I wanted to here convey a bit of like, okay, how inequality is displayed when doing COVID. And when we go into a bit more detail, I'll show you how this page reflects. And then a bit of the causes of COVID, okay, and the causes of like the the disparity of how COVID is spread in Latin America. So here we can explore the different regions, and I'm go telling you a bit more of the story of how COVID affects more like the poorest people than the richest people. And then we go on to like, what is the treatment of kind of the illness, and here basically shows the fights for equality that's been going in one specific case here, which is the case of Chile. It's been having a lot of protest, and then it goes a bit on like the ending page. So that's a bit of a journey. It's a lot of text, and as you can see, or as you saw, there is no really any hard visuals there. There's anything very complex on the technical aspect. So now that you saw, I can tell you a bit of the story. So I originally didn't think of joining Iron Viz. Like I was one of these people that look at all these amazing visualizations on Twitter, and it gets a bit like discourages. There's a lot of amazing people in Twitter. You see great vizzes every day, and I was like, well, it feels a bit of a waste of time building something. Like, I mean, I'm never gonna make it closer to the final or anything like that. And so I didn't join originally until Rodrigo mentioned that there was a contest for the Inter-American Development Bank, which was on the topic of COVID. And I was like, well, that's great. I've been working a lot with the Spanish community. I want to build something related to Latin America. So I'm going to build a visualization in COVID for Latin America. And this was the 15th of July. And I started thinking of that, no much rush. And then slowly I started seeing some of the first entries of Iron Viz that people was putting on Twitter, and I realized that COVID actually it was one of the topics of Iron Viz. At first, I thought it was just like something like well-being things, and I wasn't really interested. So when I saw that what I was building it could apply for both contests, I was building this originally in Spanish. I was like, well, I'm gonna go a bit deeper. I'm gonna build it in English, and then as when I started building it a bit more, when I started putting a bit more like time into it and starting talking with my family on the topic, it started to become more and more personal. Um, as I mentioned at the start, I study international relations and public policy. So I feel very inclined to this topic. It's something very similar to what I used to do at university. I would study a case, I would research, and I never had the chance to use Tableau this way. Like, it's not like my usual day-to-day business consulting style. It was something much more close to what I'm more passionate about. So I started building this originally for this contest, and the deadline here was the 31st of July, which was like 4 days before the Iron Viz deadline. So I basically had like 2 weeks to build it. And when I actually put all my head on saying like, okay, actually I am going to build this for Iron Viz too, it was a bit intense, mainly working on the weekends. And as I say, it was very personal, especially because COVID was affecting the region a lot, and my family lives there, and it became something that I would talk with my mom, and it's a topic that it became very close to home. And this was like one of the examples, like very close to the end of the deadline. I was talking to my mom. I was like, Mom, would you mind like checking some of if there is something wrong or incorrect with the text? And this was like before the deadline, so I was like, please don't go off on a tangent. Just, I don't have much time left until the deadline. I really wanted a just no answer because it was a touchy topic. I didn't want to say anything that sounded like that it could, someone may feel offended in Latin America. And my mom goes and sent me like a 5-minute voice message going all about like how COVID has affected and the constitution and the fight of the people. So it just shows that it's a topic that was affecting the region so badly, and I really wanted to honor that, and put an effort to it. And that's a bit how like the story went, and now how like it became a bit of like developing this, and how like I decided to start, okay, creating this whole patient journey, and how I wanted to convey about like how inequality was affecting COVID. The reason first I chose COVID, it was because the Inter-American Development Bank contest had that topic to start, and then I was like, okay, what can I say that is interesting or particular about COVID in the region? And I was like, well, I'm going to start thinking um, that inequality has affected uh, the spread of COVID around. And then you start getting a lot of hypotheses. And one of the problems that I was having is that because this was for the whole Latin American continent, I was trying to compare a lot of countries at the same time. And first it was like, okay, I have, probably like over 10 countries, 15 countries in Latin America. If I try to find the same hypothesis, something like, okay, COVID is affecting more the poor than the rich here, and trying to find a data set that kind of applies to all of them, it was very complex. So then I decided to just select 5 cities, the 5 most important cities in Latin America in terms of like GDP. And then you start looking at each city, and whilst it's true that inequality affects the spread of COVID, it does it in different ways. It's not necessarily like, okay, you have more money, then you have less COVID, you have less money, you have more COVID. So there are a lot of things that you have to analyze. And when because of what I studied, like this becomes a bit of a rigorous thing. And if you ask me, because of the lack of time of just doing it in 2 weeks, I wouldn't consider this like a great thing to put like in uni, for example. I think there's a lot of things in the analysis that probably are incomplete or very very vague and require more require a bit more detail. So this shows a bit like I started trying things. I had a hypothesis, then I started collecting the data, but the data didn't, I couldn't find data for all the countries. Or then I started building something, and I realized in the visual analysis that some things were wrong, and I had to go back to the hypothesis. And that created a very complex thing that eventually ended up in me setting for like this couple of data sets, looking at where is the location of the hospitals, how these countries, how specifically these cities compare in terms of income within like the richest parts of the cities or poor part of the cities. As I said before, I think there's still more things to put into the analysis. I think it's not as black and white as this, but it was a good experiment. It was a good experience, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think all in all, still is a good visualization. So what were my goals when I had all this a bit, put together? Well, first I wanted a visualization that looked good. I'm I really enjoy the design aspect of Tableau. My girlfriend also is an art curator, and she shows me a lot of like beautiful displays, and I wanted something that looked nice, is something that it feels a bit like it could be in some magazine or a website, or something that feels close like data journalism. I also wanted to have some interactive way, some interactivity, that it was like meaningful but not overly complex. I wanted, sometimes a lot of visualization Tableau can be static, um, but I wanted to convey some of the power of Tableau as a visualization tool that you can explore and do more analysis just by doing some clicks on it. And that was very important part of what I wanted to do, but I didn't want to, the actions to make the dashboards lower. I didn't want the actions to make the analysis go away or deviate people too much from like what is like the main branch that I was trying to show. I show you before I have a long form because the Inter-American contest require kind of like a one page, but I wanted to do something that was a bit different to all the Iron Viz entries. I didn't want to have a scroll. I wanted to have something that went back to like the original Tableau story points. So I didn't want to scroll. I wanted this, it's a bit of a click action. So you go like selecting one part and then it moves you. So it's very clear that you are in this journey and you're going to the symptoms, and it also kind of forces people in a way to read the whole page before finding that button that moves you to the next part of the analysis. I also wanted to have a mobile version, and I'm gonna show you that I did put one, but it's not really the mobile version for the Viz. I didn't have the time to do it, but I also think that when you're building something like Iron Viz, it's gonna be used a lot of people. We also share our dashboards on Twitter that are mainly consuming in the mobile version. So that was important for me to do. Sadly, I wasn't able to make it, and yeah, it's something that I definitely would recommend that if you are joining RMBs or any Bs that you're building, think of it, think of the audience. I think like mobile mobile dashboards are a very, very overlooked um, feature. I think it's something that definitely we should have more because we use our phones all the time. And the most important thing for me, this was a base made for Latin Americans. It was a base that the main the public is the Latin American people that is more interested of what's going on in the region, and hence I wanted to be in Spanish. So the build was the base was originally built in Spanish, but I also know the Tableau community works mainly in English. I know the Iron Viz judges and panelists and everyone was also English speakers. So I wanted to be able to cater them to, and for me as a bilingual, person, um, it just takes some effort, but I'm able to translate it, and I think for the effort that it takes, it pays off a lot. Like being able to show the message to more people. So this is when I was showing about the goals, how for me goes a bit the design. I'm not a designer, I'm an international relations person. So I wanted to create something that looked good. And what I do for that, I basically go to a design website, any design company. So I was looking a design company that used the font that I wanted to use. So I I found the font, I found the website. I was like, I'm just gonna look at this and try to replicate it in my Viz. And I'm gonna go back to the Viz to show you so you understand the similarity. So keep this in mind. And now, like, let's look, for example, like at this, like it's the same font, it's the same idea of like, okay, having a bit of text in one side, a bit of images in the other. Like I find my inspiration in that, and because of that, it means that I don't really have to think much of like how to build something pretty. Well, because I can just go and copy something that I consider that is pretty, and with that, like it facilitates for me the design process. So now going back to the presentation, if we go talking about the data, the data is always a very complex, interesting part of building a Viz, especially when building Iron Viz. Sourcing your data is a bit of a key part for me because I wanted to compare different countries and I wanted to do many comparisons, like 3 4 comparisons. I had to source a lot of data, and it was a very fun exercise. There was a lot of like government websites I didn't know even existed, and looking in through the data and looking through the data of my region and different countries. It was a fun experience. But yeah, sourcing your data is something that it depends a lot in the project you're trying to build. A lot of the time the data is just it's just not there, and you just have to give up on some things if you are on a time constraint. It happened a lot to me with Iron Viz. I may have had like I wanted to do, for example, understand how public transport was affecting COVID, and how also like people from lower income um, part of the cities travel more, and I wanted to do those comparisons. I was able to find transport for 2 or 3 countries, but I was still missing two. And then if I'm not able to put the 5 countries that my analysis originally started, um, it just didn't work. So it was very interesting analysis for those three countries. It was just missing for the other two. And then that happens with other types of analysis. So sourcing the data is kind of a main part of your biz, a main part of like what you're building. And I a lot of the time what I do is first find the data, then kind of build the biz, because sometimes you can get really carried away being halfway through an idea and then realize it just doesn't exist. The other option, and something that I did for the last part of this biz, is sourcing some of the data myself, but it wasn't a hard one in this case. It was just like looking at a few newspapers and getting some of the data. So as I was mentioned, some of the sources is the important thing, but then for me a big chunk of this is like, I'm talking about COVID. Everything that you build, you have a quota of responsibility in it. And in COVID, like there is a questionable thing of how reliable is government data. And because also you are building it for Iron Viz, you have certain time limit, and you don't really have the time to go on a very thorough analysis and of like if the data is all correct or not. And it happened to me like when I was showing the final product to my mom, she was like, oh, things look okay, like on a 90 something percent, but I can identify, for example, in your hospital maps, that there are a couple of hospitals that are not in the right place. They are not in the part of the city that they actually belong. So I'm sure probably if you start putting this into a magnifier, you're gonna find a lot of like um, inconsistencies, or may find things are not, like what happens, or the real things. But is the data you have, is the data is available from the government, and then, well, the only thing you can do is just try your best in that sense. Well, I already touched on the complexity of the topic and the differences in data. Well, one of the things with building this in Tableau, I have approximately like 7 data sources or something like that. And one of the things that I could have done in the prep is trying to join them, but the way I built the bees, it was just in a way that I could just use parameters instead of filters. And if you go to my bees, you're gonna see that my bees doesn't have any filters. It only has parameters, because parameters allow me to configure each one of these data sets independently. So that was very handy, because that meant that instead of me trying to find one way to put all these data sources together, which was possible, I could avoid it. And instead of that, I just had to do small preps for each one of these data sets. Each government provided the data sets a bit differently. The sourcing of the data, it was different sites, different places, but that's a bit how it went. Just, okay, I'm gonna have all these data sources, and instead of trying to put them together and spend like a few days doing that prep, let's use them independently, and with that, let's build a base. And yeah, this is a bit how it went. So these are the different data sources, and as you can see in Tableau, I just put them together. And one of the things about like building Iron Viz, you don't really have time to to have like good name conventions. And But yeah, so how the data sources were divided? Well, first I had COVID data for all the 5 cities, and these ones were like deaths, this one's COVID cases. Then I had in some cases like locations, then I have hospitals, then I had the Inter-American Development Bank data set that they provide for the contest, which gives a bit of like overviews of inequality and how like um, different quintiles earn more or less money. And I also had to do something with spatial. And by spatial, I mean there are maps in my dashboard, and something that I had to do is like some countries didn't have certain regions defined the way that I wanted, so I had to do some changes there. I had to plot the data to a specific area. And well, the reason why I'm not really showing the data prep is because most of it was done also in Alteryx. This a session for Tableau, and there is a lot of like very simple preparation, but it's like all these different would be different workflows, either if you're doing it Alteryx or Tableau prep. And now for the next probably 15 minutes or the rest, let's go a bit more into the Viz. So now we're going to go into part by part and explain you a bit more how this was built. And I'm just going to leave this one actually in the building because it's going to be easier. So this could be the first page. And the first page is if you're studying international relations, if you're studying any social science or humanities topic, or if you have written an essay, they always say you start with the introduction and then you go into the main body and then you have a bit of a conclusion. So I wanted this narrative to be very clear. So I wanted to start by a front page, and the front page could just set the topic. It would have some text showing like, okay, which are the cities we're going to be talking about, and a bit what is the main issue here. Like, okay, we have COVID and we have inequality. I wanted to put originally the buttons here to change the language in each page, but then I realized, well, I have this front page. I'm just going to leave it here. So let's touch on some of the points here. First, the buttons. This button is probably one of the things that people put a lot of attention here because I had these 2 languages. But basically this button, the only thing that does, it doesn't really change anything here. The only thing is that it navigates to another sets of dashboards, which is basically an exact copy of this, but in Spanish. So you can see this went from intro to intro 2, and now if I touch back, it just takes me back to intro. So there is no like any complex thing more than what probably if you use Tableau is just a navigation button. And that is the same also for the symptoms. So now let's talk about a bit of the design here. One of the things about the design for me when I started creating this thing, it was okay, how can I create this? I was set on this patient story. It was like, oh, maybe I can create it a bit as a medical folder. And this is kind of what I had in mind. So I was like, okay, this is gonna be the introduction, and then I'm gonna go into the symptoms and the causes and thing. And I was like, oh yeah, cool. But then you start putting it into practice, and that's when you realize you started looking a bit gimmicky, and it's not very like, good design is it would be something that at the end it distracts you really from the visualization. And that's something that teach you when you're doing any course on visualization of like, well, what's the cognitive load? Are you putting something that is unnecessary to the visual? And for me, it was important to keep it clear and to do a navigation that it was easy and that it didn't distract much. Then on the color scheme, I showed you before, took the design from this design website, then the color scheme. I was like, oh, I had something in my mind. And what I had in my mind is a company that I worked with some time ago before joining the information lab that does research, and you use it a lot when you're doing like market research, and it's called Mintel. And I was like, yeah, I want black and yellow. I kind of had it in mind. I'm not sure why. I was like, yeah, those color works. So I wanted to use that. The only thing is like black and yellow is quite a limited color palette, and of course then you can use some shades of the black and then it becomes some grays and they work too. But the problem with yellow, the shades of yellow can get very clear, hard to read. This is something that you have to go very cautious with it. And then I'm going to show you how having just two colors, it limits you when you are like coloring a map. So following on this, the other thing is that, as you can see on the layout here, I don't really have much. So this is basically the only chart of the page. And what does that mean? It means that most of this was done in PowerPoint. So if I take this, it leaves my dashboard like this. So why did I use PowerPoint? Well, I use PowerPoint some parts for the design. I wanted to have the things very being able to move the things around and play with the design, and that's a bit easier to do it in PowerPoint than in Tableau. So basically what you do here, you build a page, then you export this as an image, and then you put that into the dashboard. So one of the things that you do, you make sure that your canvas is the same size as your canvas in Tableau. So I built this, but that's say, could I have built this in Tableau? Yeah, and I did a bit here. So here for like, well, for these pages, this text, you can control it in Tableau. But what happens a lot of the times when we upload things in Tableau Public, some fonts are not supported, and that was the main reason why I use PowerPoint 2, to be able to use fonts like this one or this one that are not supported in Tableau Public, but that I thought were part for my design and something that I wanted to keep. So moving into the second page, which could be the symptoms. Well, as I say, because we don't have a long form, it's not really to scroll, and the symptoms is just at the end. And basically to get to the navigation point, kind of journey makes you go down and move here. So you go into the symptoms, and then here you have the first like kind of like, okay, you had the introduction. Now this is what could be like the previous research, the theoretical frame. So you are talking here like, okay, there is a bit of there is inequality. Let's show it some other data. So as you can see here, this is not a complex chart either. It's a scatter plot, and it has some interactivity. And this, if you click on a country, it says interact with the chart by clicking on the yellow circles. So you click on Colombia, and it brings an annotation. So it's just an annotation point and with some interactivity and two drop lines. So I really like the look of the drop lines. It gives you an idea, and it helps me like to save the numbers in the axis, in both axes, and kind of keep this looking a bit less clutter. And I really like the annotations, being able to change for each one of the countries, having a little bit more data on it. I think it looks good, and I think it provides enough information to give you an idea of, like, in this case, Colombia has more, a higher Gini means it's more unequal than Lebanon, even if it has a similar gross product per capita. So yeah, here you can see basically all these Latin American countries. The axes are shown on a world. So this is the median Gini for the world, and this is the median GDP per capita for the world. And here it shows you these countries in Latin America, they do have more money or more GDP per capita, but they are way more unequal than the rest of the world. So here, I think it's important, not everyone is familiar with the Gini. Some people may not be familiar with scatter plots, a bit of how building this legend Also building it a bit on PowerPoint, a bit a mix of PowerPoint and a mix of Tableau. Actually, this one was built on Tableau. And going back into that, yeah, just to show you, that was built here on Tableau. Is a worksheet. And basically what I had to do to keep these things, to keep the images, then you go into dashboard and then you export that image. And then I took that image. So basically the process goes, the PowerPoint image is loaded here, then this is exported, and then that export goes into the main one. So it goes PowerPoint, then that medium Tableau one where I can do add some other annotations and do stuff like this, and then this one goes as the background for here, this one here. And as the same here, as I show you, the only chart in this page could be that, like we go, we delete that, and we are just left with that and this button to take you back to where you were. And the same here. Now we can move to the diagnosis, and to move into the diagnosis, you basically would have to go into the text, understand how Gini index measure, what is represent, where Latin America sits in this, and with that you'll be able to get some context of like how inequality is measured and how big it is in Latin America, which is today the region that is like most unequal in the world. So we know Latin America has these symptoms, of inequality. So with that inequality, how it has affected, how it has like interacted with COVID, what does inequality means for COVID, and how does that translates to more cases in previous parts of the city. So here I mentioned before, we have the symptoms, then we have inequality. So now when we compare these cases, we can reach one conclusion here. The coronavirus started with the richest and it suffered most by the poorest. And here we can develop this a bit more. We can show like, okay, what's happening, the inequality is causing that more people in poorer parts of the cities are suffering. Here we also have very, probably my favorite interactivity of the dashboard. We have the 5 different cities, and these are the cases in March. We just to bring a bit of context, March is kind of like when coronavirus started a bit in Latin America. So here we have the same as before, we have the same type of map, and it shows you in this line represents the cases. So if you are on the left of this line, it means you have less cases, and this other line, the horizontal line, represents the average income. So these points here are boroughs of these cities where the income is less and the cases are less in March. And what happens then? Well, by July, the trend, it becomes completely the opposite. You realize that there are way more cases in the poorer parts of the city. And why is that? Well, there are a lot of analysis that we can bring from that, that they struggle more to shield themselves. They have less access to hospitals, less access to medical cases. And yeah, they have a bigger necessity, especially in countries like Latin America. In Latin America, compared, for example, like here in the UK, there are no things like the furlough scheme. People do need to go out in the street and need to sell stuff. There's much more informal commerce where people is selling things on the streets, and that gets represented there. There is more people in the poor parts of the city that have to commute more, take longer commutes, and we can see this across all these cities. And that was an important part for me to convey. And as you see here, this is just a scatter plot, and it's a scatter plot with one action filtering by this month. So what are the kind of like the data sources here? Well, this one has a bit more pages. Each one of these is one page, and each page has its own data source. So that's a bit of the diagnosis. Then we move from the diagnosis into what is the causes. And well, here's when I mentioned before. Oh, let's move to the other one. Use the other one. So here's where I mentioned before that my hypothesis, sometimes I couldn't find all the data. And then I started developing the story. And then I came to this part of the causes. Okay, we have the symptoms. There is inequality in Latin America. Well, that's going to be a problem for COVID. Then we have the diagnosis like, yep, there is definitely a problem with COVID and inequality. And now we have some causes. It's like, okay, well, why are these things happening? Like, why COVID has a thing with inequality, why inequality is affecting COVID. And well, here's the idea is looking into the causes. And my idea here for causes were like plenty. There are plenty of things to look, but many were different for these countries. For example, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, a lot of the boroughs that were suffering a bit more from COVID were boroughs where there is a big like amount of black population, that they are living in poorest part of the cities. In Bogota, or in Bogota, for example, it was different to the other cities, because whilst in Ciudad de Mexico or Santiago, the cities with more COVID cases were cities, not cities, the boroughs with more COVID cases were boroughs where they had less government money to spend. In Bogota, it was completely the opposite, because a couple of years ago, Bogota were like, okay, we're gonna put more money into the poorest country, into the poorest boroughs. Whilst in Santiago, each borough gets the amount of money related to what they generate. So it's very clear to see that in Santiago, the boroughs that have less money to put in public projects or in hospitals, education, roads, are also the boroughs with more COVID cases, whilst in Bogota, it wasn't necessarily that. So I started trying different things, experimenting different stuff. In Buenos Aires, I had data for transport, and I was able to see how transport affected also the spread of COVID. But at the end, the only one that I was able to find in some way, and that kind of follow a bit of the hypothesis, and here you could say it's a bit of me a bit cheeky trying to find the right analysis for my hypothesis. It was just looking at the location of hospitals. Here also is when I mentioned I have these two colors, which is black and yellow and some shades. And because of that, if I try to color, if I try to put color by cases in the map, or if I try to color all different dots in different way, it could be a bit messy. So what I decided to do is just use this color as a highlight. It's just directing you to a certain part of the city where like you can see there are more or less hospital or more or less cases. And this was like quite interesting. It was showing how like the access to health and the access to of course like to hospital beds was also causing a problem. Like there was more people dying of COVID, and here we stopped studying a bit cases, and we're studying more about deaths by COVID, and deaths was something that is a bit more strict, and it was easy for me to compare across these cities instead of cases. So we could go, for example, here looking change to a different map and showing like kind of like, okay, places that have more COVID, like these two marked with yellow, have very little amount of like hospitals. Or in Sao Paulo, how the one of the richest boroughs of the city has like over 1,000 beds dedicated to COVID, while the average of the whole of the whole city is just 172. So we looking at these different maps, looking at how like the amount of hospital, the amount of beds for COVID, and the amounts of deaths of COVID, we could understand, well, there is inequality. This inequality is causing big debts in the poorest parts of the city, and this is happening well because the poorest part of the city has less access to hospitals and have less access to beds to treat COVID. And then into that, well, it was a bit of the treatment. And what could be the treatment? I was like, I had to think a lot of like, okay, well, there's no really like a treatment. There is nothing that you can do to solve inequality in one day, and there is nothing that you can do to stop COVID from like affecting and sadly killing more people in poorest part of the cities. So I decided to go for something that you would see in an international relations or social science essay or study, and I decided to go for like a case study. So what is this case study? Well, it's the case study that I'm familiar with, which is basically Chile. Chile is a country that for probably the last 10 years, it has had contents protests just to create a more equitative society. We have protests for education, we have protests for health, we have protests for pension. And in this case, these protests have started making a difference. And the big case in Chile that the big problem thing we have in Chile is that our constitution, it comes from the 1980s, a time of dictatorship, and it was a constitution built under a dictatorship, and it was focused on the private sector. It was focused to help companies. It was focused to grow the country in a macroeconomic way, but not in a sustainable or equitative way. There is no much of welfare economy, but it's more of a thing of like supporting big companies. And this caused a big problem when it comes to COVID. And just before COVID, we had a big thing of protest. And why the protest started? Well, it's because the fare of the public transport was raised, and this caused a bit of an outrage in the people because, and it wasn't really a thing of like, oh, now they have to pay like 20p more, 10p more for the fare. Is something of like, well, people is tired of paying, and then having the government saying, like, they literally say something like, oh yeah, the public transport has gone up, but the flowers are down in case you want to buy some flowers for your loved ones. And people just go like an outrage, complete outrage. So the students started protesting first because of course they're students. They had a bit of a they can't afford things in the same way. And this eventually, on the 18th of October, it became a big riots. And by the 15th of November, um, yeah, the parliament agreed to ask for a referendum, and the referendum actually is going to be voted next month, and it's going to decide if we're going to scrap the previous constitution of Chile and start a new one that is more equitative, that is more equal, and in that with that kind of like create like a society that can deal with things like this better. And yeah, well, on that point, and sorry if I went too much of a tangent, but like if you go here in Santiago, one of the things that you can see is that the black dots are public hospital, and gray dots, which are the ones that take care of COVID the most in Santiago, are private hospital. And that comes also with what I was saying about the 1980s constitution that focus on companies and privatization and privatizing hospitals, and hence treating COVID. And just to make the link, treating COVID and preventing a death from COVID is way easier if you have access to private health compared to public health. And that's a bit how it closed the journey. And I put some phrases from like different Latin American books just to, um, put the things together to close the story. And this is something like my girlfriend, when she saw it, was like, well, Why did you do the last one in black? And basically the black one is also a bit of a design thing. If we compare it to, for example, like the first one, let's go back, is basically the same as this page, with the difference that the background is black. It's just the same, just change the background black, and then it highlights inequality. And yeah, and that's basically how the piece finishes, and that's how I close the story. So for me, it was important to create this story, was important to convey it properly. But as you can see, it's not a hard and complex piece. And I think that's probably to close the message. If you ever thought, applying to Iron Viz, you don't really have to build something that is like crazy ridiculous. In this case, it was a story that it was close to home, so I was very interested in it. It was that I like to believe that made it easier for me to create something that was easy to convey the message, to navigate. So I just created the narrative, and that's one of the points that you get, like the story. Then you saw in the design, there is nothing like super crazy, just trying to make it look good. And how did I do that? Well, I look for a design company and I copy a bit what they do. I copy their fonts and I try to keep things spread. I just decided to keep it on pages like this, and then even if you wanted to have a long form because you prefer that, I build it in long form, and I build it with pages, and then to build it in long form, you just put the pages together, and even you doing that, it looks good. So that's not hardly complex. So you have a bit of the design, you have a bit of the story, which are 2 points of the evaluation of Iron Viz, and then the last one, well, you have the analysis, and the analysis you go by exploring your data sources, by understanding the data. But I think for me it was very important building something that I was having fun, building something that I was actually interested on exploring the data. And I wish I had more time, and maybe I'll develop this a bit longer in the future, because every time I would look into something, I would be like, oh, I want to look into something else. I want to look into something else. I want to keep navigating. And that for me, I think is the key of building this. And I hope you find it useful. I hope this gives you more insight on how it was built, what is behind. And if you have any questions, you can ask me now, or always feel free to ask me on Twitter. So with that, thank you. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for taking us through that, Diego. It was really, really interesting to hear you talk about a topic that's clearly so important to you. I think at one point as well, you claimed not to be a designer, and I would have to really disagree with that. If you look at all your vizzes, they are so sleek and simple, but so impressive still. So Diego's Tableau public profile will be in the description below the video. Some of you have probably seen his vizzes already as well, but yeah, your design is amazing. So I found it really interesting to hear like where you get your inspiration, and to see that design page side by side with your viz as well. It was yeah, really good to see how you came about that design as well. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, we don't have any questions at the moment in the chat, but as you said, people could get in touch with you on Twitter. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you again, Diego, for showing us that.
No,
That was
thank you.
very interesting.
Bye.
So all is left to say is goodbye, and hopefully we'll see you again at another one of our events. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Seth. Thanks, everyone. See you.